conflict is central to all play. Play itself is the action of struggling within a specific defined set of rules, moving freely within a space, in other words. Beyond the basic struggle necessary for the act of play to exist, conflict has been central to the stories that we tell when we play. While games and all sorts of game narratives have existed for centuries, there is a certain view of modern gamers and modern games. A particular mythology surrounds the actions of these individuals and these sorts of stories. It's commonly believed that they are violent inherently, or that games risk causing violence. In 1938, the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga wrote the book Homo Ludens, which is Latin for the man at play. This book described human society as being inherently built upon the act of play. Play being, according to Huizinga, the thing that defines humanity more than anything else. The concept of play being central to our experience as humans is a really fascinating one. The suggestion that humanity is inherently built upon the idea of play makes the role of conflict in games really interesting. Because what does it mean to play? What does it mean to struggle within a space, to engage in narratives where we play out certain types of conflict if all of us do it? What is our judgment of the value of these games if it is really games and play that makes us human, that makes us unique? In his book, The Art of Computer Game Design, Chris Crawford wrote, "Conflict arises naturally from the interaction in a game. The player is actively pursuing some goal. Obstacles prevent him from easily achieving this goal. Conflict is an intrinsic element of all games. It can be direct or indirect, violent or non-violent, but it is always present in every game." Conflict and struggle is clearly present always, in human society and in games both. Conflict in structured play falls into one of a few different kinds of narratives. We have player versus player, group versus group, individual versus a group, free-for-all, player versus game, individual versus game and other players, and group versus game. Those are the main ones when we're talking about more modern structured games. Many AAA game titles utilize the more direct forms of conflict. Some of the more popular games have, for a long time, been those that involve player versus player, player versus player and game. Basically, a lot of modern games rely on the idea that a player has to struggle through violence in order to achieve their end. Recently, though, there's been a surge in the popularity of games that don't utilize this sort of storytelling and instead focus on a different form of conflict. When Gone Home was released in August of 2013, it received criticisms for being not really a game. In Gone Home, you play as Katie Greenbrier, a 21-year-old who's just spent a year in Europe. Over the course of that year, her family moved into a new home, and she's just come back in the middle of the night in a thunderstorm to find that her parents and her little sister are gone. The game is only about 2 hours long, and in it you explore the house trying to figure out what's going on. You have to hunt down certain clues so that you can find keys, and so that you can find the journal entries that your sister left for you to explain what life has been like for her over the past year. The game is touching, it's moving, it's emotional, it's deeply embedded in human relationships. It's a little bit creepy. But the one thing that it isn't is violent or based in any real struggle outside of the fact that you can't find the right keys all the time. You have to walk through this winding house looking for evidence of where your family has gone, but in the end, nothing supernatural or scary has happened to them. Your parents are just away at a couple's retreat, and your sister ran away to live with her girlfriend. This game is about relationships, but it definitely isn't about the player struggling. The player lives vicariously.
Dear Katie, so much has changed, even just since you've been away. We moved into this house. I'm in a new school, and my big sister being gone for a year doesn't make it any easier.
Gone Home is a game where you look through the eyes of someone who's looking through the eyes of other people. It's very abstract, and there's very little conflict in it. At the same time, it is an amazing game, and one which received great acclaim. When indie darling Stardew Valley came out in 2014, it ended up selling more copies than Call of Duty. The game doesn't have any guns, the worst you get is a sword for defending yourself against shadows when you go to mine for ores to upgrade your farming equipment. It's called an indie country life simulator, and it lives up to that name pretty well. You live in a small town and try to make friends with the people who live there. Your biggest antagonist in the game is a Walmart-like corporation who you can run out of business simply by farming really well and refusing to patronize them. It's a pretty simple game. I personally have over 300 hours in it, because it's also one of those games that really draws you in, and you can hold your attention for a pretty extended period of time, even though the mechanics are pretty simple, and it's not a game that's driven by violent conflict. And this general trend towards non-violent conflict in video games is even present in some AAA titles now. The Witness is a AAA title, not an indie one, and it is a puzzle game that can last hundreds of hours if you let it, depending on how good you are at puzzles. The mechanics are simple, and the story itself is just you walking around an island, completing these little puzzles that you find on little screens scattered around. The point of the game is to take in the environment, to learn how to do these puzzles, and to kind of figure out what's going on this island. It's not a game about any sort of violence, and the conflict is just the struggle against how well you can complete the puzzle. Games like Gone Home are known as walking simulators, and there's still a little bit of contention about whether or not they're really considered games, but it's undeniable that the popularity of games like Gone Home and other games that centralize a non-violent sort of conflict are increasingly popular. Now, of course, games like this have kind of always existed. To a certain extent, we've always had puzzle games. We've always had games that were a little bit experimental. But up until recently, these sorts of games were often confined to small groups of players, mostly cult followings when they received success. However, these sorts of games are becoming increasingly popular, even being published by AAA developers, and that shows a shift in the landscape of games. As much as I love my violent video games, it's fascinating to see the way that the mythology plays out when the landscape of games is no longer dominated by games like Black Ops, Call of Duty, Halo, but instead is dominated by a mixture of Assassin's Creeds and Stardew Valleys, Gone Homes and Calls of Duties,